The personal computer market has changed a lot in the past 2 years, and the differences between Mac and PC are starting to break tradition. And even though the great Mac vs PC debate rages on and will continue to do so, the introduction and subsequent evolution of Apple Silicon has already started to disrupt the status quo. For example, are Macs actually good at gaming now? Well, more on that later. So here are my thoughts and a few main things I'd like to discuss after spending the last year testing, benchmarking, and using both Team Mac and Team PC. Now, disclaimer, I use both Mac and PC on a daily basis, and at the end of the day, I'm not saying one is better than the other. As always, you should buy whichever one you like best that also suits your needs. So let's start with performance. Now, in the past, it's been generally accepted that PC systems are more powerful when compared to Macs. And in a lot of areas, even with Apple Silicon, this is still true, like gaming, 3D modeling and rendering, machine learning, and several more. The Mac gets destroyed in these areas, often due to software not being optimized. But if you take a look at other areas, mainly the creative side of things, they're either pretty comparable or just straight up better on an Apple Silicon Mac. Take the Adobe suite for example, something that usually ran better on a Windows PC. Now, Adobe being buggy in general and crashing all the time aside, once it got updated for Apple Silicon Macs, the results were impressive. Take After Effects for example. It only received native Apple Silicon support in mid-2022. And as you can see, the M1 Max MacBook Pro was able to outperform an Intel 12900H and RTX 3080 Ti laptop in both Puget Bench and a real-life 2D animation scene. This was also the case when looking at video editing, which traditionally has been a strong point already for Macs, but it is impressive nonetheless to see it outperforming a high-end Intel and RTX system in almost every area. But if the Mac can't use its dedicated encode and decode media engines that support H.264, HEVC, and ProRes codecs, it kind of falls apart. So it really depends on the specific workflow you're throwing at each machine. Regardless of what system you end up choosing, you should also use a password manager, which is where NordPass, the sponsor for this section of the video, comes in. Now more than ever, your online data is at risk. Take it from someone whose passport just got leaked by their old mobile phone provider. Yeah, true story. That's why it's so important to have a secure password. If you do get hacked or someone steals your password, they can gain access to all of your photos, videos, emails, credit cards, and more. Or worse, they can even steal your identity. NordPass is more than just a password manager. You'll get access to several really cool features like a built-in password generator that allows you to tweak exactly how strong your passwords are, or emergency access, allowing you to add someone that will be able to access your passwords in the event you are no longer able to. Like me, almost having a heart attack when I saw how much I spent on Apple products this year.
So get exclusive access to NordPass's best offer using the link in the description, or use code CreatedTech at the checkout to get an additional 1 month for free.
Now, getting back to performance, let's take a quick look at gaming, because this is something that only very recently changed massively. Earlier this year during WWDC 2022, Apple announced an update to their very own Metal API. Now, if you're not familiar with Metal and what it does, it's basically the Apple version of Vulkan or DirectX. DirectX as in what most modern games run on. Now, these graphics APIs essentially act as a middleman between the software and the hardware of your computer. And if the required API to run a certain game isn't compatible with your operating system, you simply can't play that game. And that's a problem for Macs, because DirectX doesn't really work on Apple Silicon, and it's the API that most games you'd want to play run on. That's where Metal 3 comes in. Apple seems to be putting a lot of time and effort into making Mac gaming more accessible to game developers. And Metal 3 has a number of really cool new features, like Metal FX upscaling, or the fast resource loading API. In layman's terms, this is Apple essentially saying to game developers, hey, we just made it way easier for you to translate your games into the Metal API and allow them to be played on Macs. And Capcom answered the call with their new AAA rated game, Resident Evil Village. It now runs natively on Apple Silicon. That's right, no Rosetta 2 parallels or emulation software required. And the results were pretty good. I mean, on the M1 MacBook Air, which doesn't have a fan and is now over 2 years old, I was able to have a pretty decent experience at medium and low settings. Sure, I was mostly stuck between 30 to 40 FPS, and there was a little bit of stuttering and dropped frames, but hey, it's still pretty impressive for a newly released AAA rated game. Definitely better than any Windows laptops with integrated graphics. And when I bring the big boys in, a 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro with 32 GPU cores and 32 gigabytes of unified memory, and a Windows gaming laptop with the latest Intel 12900H CPU and RTX 3070 Ti GPU, the results are interesting. Using an external monitor and at the same resolution and graphical settings, the gaming laptop still destroys the Mac, getting around double the FPS, and obviously the gaming laptop is much cheaper, but the game is still running pretty well on the MacBook. And if I turn on VSync and lock the FPS to 60, it actually runs just as well and as smoothly as the gaming laptop, albeit with lower FPS. And if you want to see a full video on this topic, I'll link it down below. So, pretty promising, right? Obviously, in my opinion, it will still be years until the needle on Mac gaming moves significantly. And I still think a proper Windows gaming laptop will always be better. But this is probably the most significant improvement to Mac gaming we've seen in a while. Now, one other major difference between the two platforms is obviously fan noise, heat, and power draw. In all of my comparison videos, including that gaming test I just did, the Windows computers get way hotter than the Apple Silicon Macs. They also need to run their fans at a much higher RPM, which results in some massive noise differences. And they not only suck 2 to 3 times more power, but need to be attached to their charger for full performance. Unlike, of course, the Apple Silicon MacBooks, which is so efficient that their battery is able to provide enough wattage even at maximum performance. If you look at the powerful desktop offerings from both teams, like this custom 12900K and RTX 3090 build I did a few months ago, and a 48-core GPU M1 Ultra Max Studio, the power draw differences are massive. And I did get a bit of criticism on that video for mentioning that. People were like, who cares about power draw when you're after maximum performance? And while that might be true in some situations, since that video, the cost of power in many areas has tripled or more, which might make some people think twice before going with a beefy RTX system, especially the newly released RTX 4090, which sucks almost 400 watts under load. Although, to be fair, you can underclock those cards and reduce the wattage by 75 to 150 watts and only lose a few percentage points of performance. But speaking of the RTX 4090, let's talk about the future for a second, because I'm not too sure how Apple Silicon is going to fare against some of the new tech coming out from Intel, Nvidia, and AMD. And without going into too much technical detail here, I think Apple is in trouble. Intel seems to be finally waking up from that decade-long slumber and actually coming out with some pretty significant improvements to their CPUs. Their new 13th gen CPUs, for example, are impressive and wreck anything that Apple Silicon has to offer in terms of performance. And the wattage isn't too bad either. There are also rumors that Intel is developing their own high-performance, ultra-efficient CPUs specifically targeted at outperforming Apple Silicon. And that isn't really that surprising because I think a lot of these manufacturers are going to be putting a big focus on ARM-based systems in the next couple of years. Not to mention, Intel has just entered the GPU game with their Arc GPUs, which is going to create a lot of healthy competition, hopefully, for both Nvidia and AMD, which already have pretty impressive updates to their flagship cards. And with all of these new updates and renewed competition, Apple could find itself losing whatever advantage it currently has. So yeah, it's safe to say that 2022 has been a pretty interesting year. I mean, we had the M1 Ultra chip come out earlier this year. We also had a brand new M2 MacBook Air and a new M2 chip. But compared to PC and Intel and Nvidia and all the crazy new stuff that's come out on that side, I think Apple is in big trouble, like I said before. And I think 2023 and beyond, 24, 25, when we potentially start seeing a bigger focus on ARM-based systems in general, it's just going to be very, very interesting to see how everything pans out and how the two platforms stack up against each other. But apart from that, guys, thanks for watching this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.